The boards were gray and split at the ends, stacked on the curb of SE Division Street, with a hand-lettered cardboard sign in blue marker that said free, and, after 2 days of Portland rain dissolved the cardboard into pulp, no sign at all. Nobody wanted them. That was the situation on a Tuesday morning in late March when Caleb Hurst stopped walking and looked. He was 22, tall and lean in a way that made his olive army surplus jacket hang off his shoulders, the zipper broken and wired shut at the bottom with a short piece of copper wire because a broken zipper in Portland in March is a cold problem, not a style problem. Black Carhartt work pants frayed at the cuffs, brown work boots, one full size too big, found in a donation pile outside a church on Powell in November because they were boots, and they were there and they fit enough to matter. His hair was growing out in short lokes, just beginning to lock, dusted with actual sawdust he'd been carrying since finding some wood scraps 2 weeks earlier, and not having anything useful to do with them yet. A small scar cut through his left eyebrow, faded now from whatever childhood thing had put it there. He parked his blue plastic cart next to the pile, the cart he'd found behind a Rei dumpster back in November, and he counted the boards. 40, he thought. Maybe a couple more. Cedar, probably, or something close. The rot was at the ends, where the fence posts had been set in the ground, where years of ground moisture had worked inward through the end grain. But the faces of the boards were different. He crouched down and pressed his thumbnail into the center of one. No give. The wood pushed back solid. He stood there for what was probably 4 minutes. Anyone passing on SE Division that Tuesday morning would have seen a 22-year-old with starting locks and a wired-up jacket standing still next to a pile of discarded wood in light rain, and most of them would have formed a conclusion about the situation in about 2 seconds and kept walking. He loaded the cart. Marcus noticed first. Marcus had been living on the Springwater corridor for 3 years, which is long enough to have a sense of what was worth hauling and what wasn't. And when he saw Caleb returning with a cart stacked sideways with wet cedar boards, his read was immediate. "Man," he said, "those are trash boards. Why are you hauling trash?" Caleb said he was going to build something. Marcus said build what? And Caleb said he wasn't sure yet, but he'd figure it out. That was the honest answer. He had the outline of an idea, a structure with a floor off the ground, walls without gaps, a roof that moved water instead of collecting it, but the specific plan was still assembling itself in his head, the way a plan assembles when you know the materials and you know the skills, and you just haven't yet stood in the exact spot or done the exact measurements. He knew what he was going to make. He just hadn't named every cut yet. He had learned to work that way from his uncle in Decatur, Georgia. Not from instructions, not from a class, just from years of being near someone who worked. His uncle framed walls, cut angles, ran rafters, explained things out loud while doing them the way some people teach, without ever using that word for it. Caleb had been 9, 10, 11 years old, handing tools when asked, carrying lumber, watching the same operations done with different wood until they stopped looking like operations and started looking like the natural way of someone who understood what wood was doing at any given moment, how it moved when it got wet, how it contracted when temperature dropped, why you didn't end nail a rafter when a toenail would hold longer. Things like that, the kind of thing that doesn't leave you even when a lot of other things do. The situation in Decatur ended when Caleb was 13. He came through Multnomah County foster care after that. Aged out at 18, tried an apartment in Lentz at 19. A room in a shared house that worked fine until November, when the person on the lease disappeared, and the landlord gave everyone 30 days, and that was that. Tried the distribution center job near 82nd, night shifts, 10 hours. The money was okay until the contract ended in February with a week's notice. 7 months ago, he'd come to the Springwater corridor with a waterproof bag, and the contents of it. None of that meant he didn't know how wood worked. He made 3 trips to get all the boards back to his spot. The first took an hour and 20 minutes. The cart was loaded past what it was built for, and Caleb had to lean his whole body into the weight of it to keep it moving. sweating through the jacket in March, because exertion doesn't check the calendar. A cyclist passing on the second trip slowed down and asked what he was building. Caleb said, "A shelter." The man looked at the boards stacked on the cart, looked at Caleb, said, "Those are fence boards," and rode on, as if naming the category of the material answered a question he'd been asking. 42 boards total. He sat with them Thursday afternoon in the space he'd chosen under the Holgate overpass, where a concrete pillar gave him a fixed anchor point, and the angle of the overpass cut the worst of the northwest wind. He looked at what he had. A handsaw, traded for a pair of boots the previous summer, a hammer, a coffee can that had been filling with nails for months, pulled from pallets, from discarded wood scraps, from any board he found with hardware still in it. 2 ratchet straps, rope, the tarp he'd been sleeping under. No drawing, nothing on paper. The plan was in his head and had been since Tuesday morning, since the thumbnail test, and by Thursday it was complete. He was going to build a structure. Not a lean-to, not a tarp and pallet arrangement that fails by the 3rd week of rain. A real structure, floor frame raised off the cold ground on concrete blocks, double-layer board walls so the gaps between fence boards on the outer face were covered by solid wood. On the inner face, a pitched roof steep enough to move Portland rain off the surface, and a door on hinges that closed and latched. He knew which boards were going where. The cleanest faces for the walls, the longest for the roof pitch, the ones with rot nearest the ends for the floor frame, where he could cut past the damaged sections and still have solid lumber underneath. Nothing was going to be wasted. That instinct, looking at an imperfect piece of material and finding what was still usable in it, he had been carrying from Decatur for 11 years without knowing exactly how much of it he'd kept. He started cutting Thursday morning, marked lines with a carpenter's pencil he kept clipped inside the jacket pocket, ran the handsaw the way his uncle had shown him, not pushing down into the wood, pulling back, letting the teeth do the work, because fighting a handsaw is slower than trusting it. He cut floor joists, wall studs, the 4 corner posts that everything else would attach to. Marcus came by that afternoon and stood about 10 feet away without saying anything for around 40 minutes, just watching the cutting, watching the pieces accumulate in a pile that was starting to look organized. Eventually he said, "What is that going to be?" Caleb said, "A house." Marcus said, "Yeah, for real." Marcus watched a few more minutes and went back to his spot. By Saturday, the floor frame was built. He assembled it flat on the ground, then looped the ratchet straps around the concrete pillar and used them to lift the frame onto 4 concrete blocks he'd carried from a construction debris pile, 2 blocks east, on Holgate. The floor sat 8 inches off the ground. Cold ground under a shelter pulls heat out through your floor faster than almost anything a thin sleeping bag can compensate for. Caleb knew this. 7 months of waking up stiff and cold from the ground, no matter what he put between himself, and it had made this knowledge physical, not theoretical. The floor frame was not optional. 8 inches was the minimum. People had started slowing down on the path by Saturday. Cyclists, a woman in running clothes who took a photograph without stopping, a man with a dog who watched Caleb work for several minutes and said that looked like real construction. Caleb said it was. There's something that happens when a structure goes vertical. A floor frame lying flat on the ground reads to most people as a pile of lumber. When the walls start going up and the thing begins to exist in 3 dimensions, it stops reading as material and starts reading as a building that's going to exist. You can actually see the category change in people's eyes when they look at it. It happens fast. The walls went up through the 2nd week, corner posts set and braced first. Horizontal rails top and bottom. Fence boards nailed face-to-face across the rails so every gap on the outer layer had solid board behind it on the inner layer, the same principle as shiplap, more or less, arrived at by logic rather than by that word for it. He doubled the boards on the northwest wall, the one that took the prevailing wind directly, 6 boards thick on the windward face. That wall was going to hold. He found insulation on a Wednesday the 2nd week, a partial roll of fiberglass bat propped against the side of a salvage supply store on SEA Hawthorne that was setting out materials it couldn't sell. because the packaging was torn. He asked the owner if he could take it. The owner said yes. He carried it back, balanced over his shoulder, a full roll of insulation on a 22-year-old in a broken zippered army jacket on S.E. Hawthorne at midday. And the people he passed had that expression, not recognition, just the brief look of someone's mental category failing to form before you're already past them. He cut the insulation to cavity width and packed it between the board layers on every wall. The tarp he'd been sleeping under, he cut into flat panels and laid them against the interior wall faces behind the insulation, stapled at the edges. Not a professional moisture barrier, the honest version is that it was imperfect. It was also going to be warmer than anything else on the Springwater corridor. By a margin he didn't need to calculate because he could already feel it standing inside the framed walls in late March, with no roof yet. You've probably slept somewhere cold enough that it didn't matter how exhausted you were, where the cold came up through the floor or through the wall beside your head, and you just lay there doing the math on how many more hours until it was light enough to get up. That feeling, that's what the floor frame was about. Not a building philosophy, not a plan, just that specific feeling and knowing one thing that stops it. The roof took 3 days. He had to think about it carefully. The pitch needed to be steep enough for Portland rain, which isn't the dramatic vertical rain that drains itself. It's long, flat, horizontal sheets that arrive from the west and settle onto any surface that gives them a chance to pool. He needed steep pitch. But he also needed a pitch he could fasten from inside the structure alone, without a second person holding boards while he nailed. He found the angle by eye, tried it with a straight board held against the top of the wall, adjusted it twice, and settled on something close to a 4-1-2 slope. He cut the ridge beam from his 3 longest boards, jointing them end to end with nails driven at opposing angles so the joint pulled tight under load. His uncle had a name for that joint. The name had been gone from Caleb's memory for years, just gone, and the moment he was making it with his hands, the name came back from wherever it had been waiting. Marriage joint, that's what his uncle had called it. A marriage joint. He drove the nails and the joint locked, and he moved on. He nailed the last roof board on a Thursday. Marcus came over and stood beside him as the final nails went in. When the last one was driven, Marcus looked at the whole thing for a moment and said, "Man, that is a real house." Caleb said, "Yeah." Marcus said, "No, I mean that is an actual real house." And Caleb set the hammer down. The door had been waiting since S.E. Clinton. He'd found it on a Sunday morning leaning against a dumpster 3 weeks earlier. A pre-hung interior door, hinges still in the frame, cracked straight down the center panel from being dropped or kicked, but solid everywhere else. He'd walked it back in 2 sections carried over his shoulder. The people he passed that morning had that look he'd gotten familiar with by then. The one where you see someone and the category you reach for doesn't quite form, and you have to look twice. He glued the crack with wood glue from the dollar store, clamped it overnight with the ratchet straps wound tight around the door face. By morning, the glue had set. The crack was still visible if you looked for it, but the door was one piece again, solid when you pressed on it, and it swung on its hinges without catching. He hung it on a Saturday. Thin Portland rain still going, the kind that makes you wet before you can identify the moment it started. He'd been outside for 8 hours. He was wearing everything he had. The jacket, the Carhartts, the 2 big boots, a wool beanie he'd found in a free bin outside a coffee shop on Burnside, sawdust in his locks from a week of cutting, a blister on his right palm from the hammer that he hadn't paid attention to because there wasn't a point in paying attention to it. The latch was from a kitchen cabinet he'd found in a dumpster on S.E. Woodstock 3 weeks before he'd ever seen the fence boards on S.E. Division. He'd pulled it off because it was good hardware, and you keep good hardware because someday you'll need it. He'd been carrying it in the coffee can with the nails. It fit the door frame the way something fits when you are right to save it. He hung the door. He fitted the latch plate. He swung the door shut and heard the latch click. He opened it again, stepped inside, pulled it closed behind him. The floor was dry, completely dry, solid underfoot, with no flex anywhere. The walls were tight, no draft he could feel at any of the joints. The 2 small windows, rectangles cut into the board walls and fitted with pieces of clear plastic sheeting from the Salvaged store on Hawthorne, edges sealed with the last of the caulk from a tube he'd found in someone's trash, let in flat March light that made the interior look like a place someone had decided on. Not landed in, decided on. He sat down on the floor. I want you to understand what that moment was, and I don't mean that in an abstract way. 7 months of waking up to check whether the bag had stayed dry, 7 months of cold that came up through the ground from underneath you, regardless of how many layers you put between yourself and it. 7 months of strangers placing you in a category in 2 seconds and not looking past it. And then 42 cedar fence boards on a curb on SE Division Street that every other person had walked past without stopping, and 12 days of work with a handsaw and a coffee can of nails, and a latch from a kitchen cabinet that had been riding in that can for 3 weeks waiting for its door. He had built something with his hands that was warmer, drier, and more solid than most of what people call temporary housing. Not a tent, not a tarp over poles arrangement that leaks by week 2. A structure with a framed floor, insulated walls, a pitched roof, and a door that latched shut. From boards that had been labeled garbage, word moved through the Springwater corridor the way it always moves in a place where people are paying close attention. Not broadcast, just person to person, because attention is a tool you can't afford to put down. A woman named Drea, 2 years on the corridor, came by and stood outside the structure for a few minutes, and then stepped inside and said, "How did you do this?" Not skeptical. "Just asking," he told her over the next few days. The logic of the floor frame first. Why you raise it off the ground. The reason the windward wall gets doubled. How a marriage joint works when you don't have a single board long enough to run the ridge. She listened the way you listen when you're trying to understand if a thing is actually available to you. She asked if he could help her build one. He said yes. The second structure went up faster. Caleb wasn't learning anymore. He was working, and Drea learned quickly. A man named Tom, 28, who'd grown up doing landscaping in Salem and knew how to read a level, came over on the 3rd day because he'd been watching from a distance. And he had tools, and the combination was useful. Tom had a battery-powered drill, 2 charged batteries, and a bag of exterior screws. That drill changed what was possible, not in a dramatic way, just in the boring, useful way where something that took an afternoon takes 2 hours instead. With the handsaw alone, Caleb was limited to how much he could cut before his arm gave out. With the drill running, the cuts were the bottleneck, not the fastening, and that's a completely different kind of work. The third structure, 4 people were working on it. Nobody organized this. There was no plan. There was a 22-year-old who had stopped on a Tuesday morning in the rain on SE Division Street and crouched down and pressed his thumbnail into the center of a fence board to see if anything was still solid. And there were people around him who saw what he'd built and needed to know how he'd done it. Those are the only 2 things that were required. The easier version of this story is that Caleb was the exception, the one with the uncle in Decatur and the accumulated knowledge and the eye for what was still good in a discarded thing. That version is easier to hold. It fits in a category. The version he would tell you is different. The boards were good. Most people hadn't stopped to check. His uncle had shown him things in Decatur 12 years ago that he'd been carrying in his head ever since, without knowing exactly how much of it he was still holding, or what it was going to be for. The latch had been in the coffee can for 3 weeks before he had any idea what door it was going to fit. The knowledge was already there. So were the materials. They'd been sitting on a curb on SE Division for 2 days with a cardboard sign that the rain had already eaten. Someone just had to stop and check. The morning after the door went on, thin rain still coming down, Caleb got up off the dry floor, put on the jacket with the wired zipper, stepped outside, and started walking. He already knew what he was looking for. He'd gotten good at knowing what other people had stopped seeing.